Hello, this is your host, Ray Johnson of Instagram Christianity, and today I have a special guest, as alluded to last week, to wrap up this season. I have my very own mom, Angie Johnson. And similar to my grandma, Caroline Lyle, we're going to talk about generational differences of when she grew up in the 70s with more of her late childhood, early teen years, and also comparing the workforce as, unlike grandma, mom is actively working in the workforce and the difference of societal expectations then versus now, and incorporating Christianity throughout. So, to begin, just as much as you're comfortable with, paint an overview of your childhood and the Christianity standards that were then in those church times.
Well, back in the late 60s and 70s and early 80s, the Christianity was very much as I was taught, and especially in the South. And I don't mean only the South, throughout the Bible teachings, is that what the Bible said was true. And there was no, well, let's fix this to fit my need and let's fix that to fix my need. It was pretty much, if God said that, that's what it meant. And we had to go by those. Now, there were many, many times in my life where when God said, this is the way it should be, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, I don't like that. And it didn't fit what I wanted to do. But I learned over time that what he was saying is, follow me, follow my ways. You won't always follow my ways. You won't always do what I do, but try and see where that leads you. And so I did. And I had a spiritual, eternal falling away from Christ, probably about the time of college to before I was 30. And that seemed to be very common. You fall away from your family because you move or you go to college and you're away. And you think, well, I'm going to do my own thing. And when I did my own thing, it wasn't always the right thing, but I did it. And I learned from those lessons. Am I happy? Am I fulfilled? Am I at peace? And most of the times when I was not following God's word, I was not happy. I really wasn't at peace. And there was something missing in my life and my soul. And I came to recognition of that. And I would come and I would go and I would come and I would go. And that kind of goes with what Apostle Paul said was, I can't remember exactly which Bible, probably Corinthians or some of his writings. But, I have these yearnings or these sins that I keep going back to. And I don't want those things, but they're just there. And Christ says, yeah, I know you're not going to be perfect. And, the evils that we feel and we see and we live through are there. We're not in heaven yet. We're not in perfection. We're in a broken world. And so we're not going to be perfect.
And speaking of which, I actually wanted, with whatever you're willing to, of course, to elaborate upon those mindsets that you had when you were struggling with Christ, because especially people in my generation about my age and even younger, high schoolers, which is crazy thing about this, another generation that's not mine, going through all these, especially with the inundation of social media these days, with comparison and thinking you should have a better life and, I should be doing this instead. And it's that much easier to get involved in the world versus Christ. So when you were growing up, although far different society with technology and all that when you grew up, what was some of the more prominent moments that you struggled where someone listening could possibly relate to?
Well, part of the struggle was looking at modern day times, and whether you're living in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or the 2000s, was what's changed. And it's always been people. And the majority of what I see that's changed and influential to people is media. It's outlets of voices of people. And God doesn't change. He wrote this book. He said, here it is. I'm everlasting, and I am never changing. And we change, and we're not everlasting. So we're far different from God and who He says He is to us. So, growing up in the 60s and 70s and 80s, which is I was born and grew up as a young person and a young adult, You look at these ages and these days and you say, well, why is this changing? God hasn't changed. We have. Man
Mhm.
has. And why does the change come about? The change comes about because we don't want to be responsible for our behavior. Just plain and
And
simple.
speaking of change, I'm curious because, you know, you were drawing in broad strokes comparisons of how you grew up versus today. And it reminded me of a study I read a few years ago talking about how the mental state of my generation, with going to college and all that, we have the same stability as those who are all up in the Dorothea Dix Insane Asylum. Like, that's how bad the straits we are because of the societal expectations we have and the technology of how we communicate it all and observe things. So, for when you were growing up, what were some of the pressures in your expectations of society that you had dealt with where you easily thought you were going insane yourself?
I would say that most of the social pressures I had growing up was, did I fit in
Mm-hmm.
with people my age, my class? It wasn't so much, am I following the media or the Bible, but do I fit in?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody needs to have a sense of being, and that being could be accepted into a group. There's just so many groups, and was I accepted in high school? Was I accepted in popularity? Was I accepted with my parents? And it wasn't so much the media back then because it didn't, I'm sorry, have the strength that it does now in influencing people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the influence really needs to come from biblical scriptures and parents and morality because that's really what saves us. And I'll take you to a little story, and it meant everything to me, even as a young child, as I was in middle school when I thought about this. And when Christ died, and it's mentioned several times in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John,
Mm-hmm.
and what they witnessed, he looked down upon the people after they had stabbed him and ridiculed him and put a crown of thorns on him, and just he was almost dead. He was at that point where he was going to die, and he looked up towards heaven, and with two uh, other sinners on either side of him and hung on the cross, and they were tied to the cross, not nailed to it.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, God, our Father, forgive them, all those people who were wanting him to die, for they know not what they do. Now, these people weren't just the scourge of society. They were intelligent. They were business owners. They were, uh,
Government
yeah,
officials.
all government officials, pillars of society.
Mm-hmm.
They were a mix of people who should have seen this. They were Roman soldiers and so forth. And he said, forgive them for not what they do. And that told me something. And what it told me is you don't seek your wisdom through people, you seek it through the scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Because Christ saw through it. And he said, forgive them. His love is so strong, no matter what your sin is and how different and separate you think you may be from God, you're not. Because he loves you just as you are. And he says, come just as you are. He will straighten out your burdens. He says, give your burdens to me. I have the strength to do it.
Now, I know you said that you made that connection as far as the knowledge of that and probably starting to feel that within your being with that revelation. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious of when you actually felt that those principles and the application of God's true mindset of us when he looks at us, how did you finally, like, what age approximation did you finally feel within your being, not just logically, but emotionally and spiritually, that to be true?
I would say I was probably about 12. And
Really? That
because
young?
when I was 12, the media wasn't as prevalent and the internet and everything. So I didn't have the amount of information that people do today. So I went by a moral compass that was given to me by my parents or peers or teachers or people of influence.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to say, okay, this is how I ought to act. And a lot of that was coming through reading scriptures, going to church every Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
So nowadays, there's so much information out there that could be contrary to the Bible, going against what God said. And He's our Creator. He knows what we need and we love, and what's important to us, and He loves us. He's not looking at your sin; He's looking at His love for you, and the correction of the sin that you may have between God and yourself can be corrected by knowing God and reading His Word and being close to Him. So a lot of the Christian thing is, oh, let's blame somebody, let's judge somebody. And Christ was not about judging, and God really wasn't about judging. He's
Mm-hmm.
just saying, these are things that are offensive to me, and here's how you can come closer to me. So Christ was ever loving, and he says, I love you very much. But there's this sin, we have to correct it. Because I'm God's son and without sin. And I lived in a world just like you do, and it was hard for me. But I did it.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows that we can't. Because remember what he said on the cross, forgive them for they know not what they do.
And speaking of correction, I
Mhm.
wanted to get more of your thoughts on fast forwarding, if you will, to modern times, where I'm sure you noticed this growing up, but since it's a lot more of a me mindset ever since the 90s, really.
Mhm.
What have you noticed in the church, especially, about, and you touched on this very briefly just now, those that are basically Pharisees and being fake about Christianity and advertising Christianity in such a stereotypically incorrect way that people assume that that's the basis of how Christianity is to be when it's really false?
Yeah, and the sins are very wide. And you look at the Ten Commandments: thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not steal, and adultery, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Those are still, they still stand strong today. And when you look at sin, it's not any one sin, because God sees all sin as equal, as being separate from Him.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to learn to live under His light and His forgiveness. He says, give me your burdens. If you're having a burden that's a sin against me, I will help you with that sin. And um, in today's times, there's so much forgiveness and lackadaisicalness on morality and sin. And we have to come to the conclusion that when we're not doing what we want to do in God, it doesn't mean that He doesn't love us, because He'll always love us.
Mm-hmm.
And He has said so. Any sin you have, any sin that's offensive to God, He still wants you to come to Him and be forgiven by Him. He loves you very much. And He doesn't judge you for that sin. He just judged the sin. He says, this is opposite for what I need you to be like me. We have to prepare ourselves to be with our Creator and to go to heaven. We don't want to go in the southern direction, if you will, or south. That's not a fun place. We've all been very prompt on that.
I love that
But
phrasing.
the thing is that today, that's got Christianity so upset with people, is that there's too many people who are not true Christians, who say, I don't like your attitude, so I'm going to go on the Christian train and say, well, this is what the Bible says. But they're no more Christians than somebody who's very offensive towards
Mm-hmm.
Christianity. So Christianity is loving, forgiving, and calling, come just as you are. Christ will forgive you. He will take your burdens. He understands what you feel, and He can
Mm-hmm.
correct that. And He wants those burdens, and He can carry them. He says, lay your burdens on me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you think about what happened back when I was young and versus what happened today, everything was, you were held accountable when I was young and growing up in the 60s, 70s, and part of the 80s. And then after that, getting the late 80s, early 90s, it was all excuse or blame, and I'm not responsible for myself.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll always be responsible for ourselves. And in the end, when it all comes out, whether you're here on earth and you're being at an ends with your boss or your family or God, the end is you are responsible for your
Mm-hmm.
behavior, and you have to be held accountable to it. The law even says so. Even
Yeah.
an imperfect humanistic law says, no, you are responsible for your behavior, and you're going to be punished for that. And that's the same thing God is saying, but He's so much more forgiving than even our laws that we set forth. We tend to be not so forgiving. Christ is, and He says, bring your burdens on me. I will forgive you, and I love you. Come with me with all your sins and things that are imperfect, and I will love you, and I will help you through it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that message has been lost through judgmentalness and people believing that they are maybe better or higher up than somebody else because they don't think they sin, and they do. The smallest of sins is just as great as the greatest of sins, because that small sin can keep you away from Christ and heaven and God just as much as a horrendous sin.
And there's actually a couple points I wanted to touch on that, I mean, all of what you said, amazing, of course. But immediately what comes to mind from that is you were talking about burdens, laying burdens upon Christ, and then just now we're talking about being better than someone else. It makes me think a lot about the mental health movement, in which a previous podcast I talked to my sweet friend Mallory. She's talking about how doctors still can't find cures for her migraines. She's somehow such a strong Christian. I couldn't do it if I was going through what she did. Nowhere near as sweet as her. No way. But, she's amazing with that. And I'm just curious when it comes to quote unquote problems like that are internal, you can't see. They're not physical disabilities like that you easily have a plate for or a tag for your car and they come out amputated, like, yes, a disability. But then it's the mental ones that people can't see and they're like, well, why do you have a space like there too? And I'm curious with contextualizing that. I feel comfortable enough now talking about it due to time and distance from it. But you know that when I get upset, I tend to be very depressive and I internalize and I analyze things to death. Where I don't like being around myself sometimes, I'll be honest, and I have to live with myself, so it's like, well, here we go. But especially in high school, when I felt there were times I couldn't really do much, couldn't exactly, get a job or do something, whatever, where I felt like I was contributing to you guys, even though it's not my burden. But I just felt that there's something I could do, and I just got really depressed. And then I have a few times later in life, and even earlier this year, when I got really sick, because it was more of a fight of ambition with my body and spirit versus my physical body not living up to that at that time. So I'm sure when you were younger, about my age, even possibly younger, you may have been really sad and things, especially because, you had two brothers getting to exactly talk to within the family, a girl your age, even though you had Granny. So as far as those hidden battles and demons that people fight, whether it's depression or other aspects of that, what are your thoughts on those hidden battles that people don't typically really like to talk about because then they feel lesser than?
Well, a hidden battle is something that you have to work on yourself. You may not necessarily be able to share it with someone because the fear of them not understanding or not having the right uh, information for you. Just like we go back to that crisis, they don't know what they do.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to go and seek people who are imperfect and ask for their opinion. And that's why it's so important to stay within the Bible and the scriptures and to pray to God and say, this is what I'm struggling with. I don't understand it. You promise you take my burdens and that you're my father. You care for flowers and their color and animals and so much more for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to come to Christ and we mean more to him. We're more like him. He created us in his own image. He loves us unconditionally and he wants us to come with us or to him with our burdens and our shortcomings. And he's not looking to judge us. He's looking to understand us, forgive us, and show us the light.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we need to be willing to take. Taking the light of the word, and I've looked at many, many different doctrines. And because of this love for us that he has, and he calls himself our Father, our Heavenly Father. And he has greater gifts for us than our earthly fathers, and he loves us more.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why he sent his son to die a horrendous death with a fantastic, loving message. And yet, still, we rejected him. And again, I keep going back to that. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And all that pain and misery and insult, and Christ still forgave us. It's a phenomenal being. And we should listen to what he says. No one else in human history has been so forgiving and so miraculous in what they did for humankind and healing us and raising us from the dead
Mm-hmm.
and loving us.
And speaking of healing, I want to further extend on the question of inner battles with more so, what would you advise someone who, like me at one point, felt that their problems were insignificant because, you don't have cancer or something, just to be dramatic for the point. So therefore you are even afraid to go to God, much less someone else, like to get help if you need to with a therapist or so forth. So what do you recommend for those who struggle with depression and similar battles that are too
Well,
afraid?
that's a good question. Well, you don't have to feel like that I'm not going to be heard because my problems aren't as great as somebody who's about to be beheaded or someone who's in jail or in the midst of a rape or a near death experience. And so he says, come to me, like great or small. He's not going to not listen to you because it's not the ultimate problem in the world right then. The Jewish people were terribly mistreated. Slaves were terribly mistreated, and slaves came in all forms. Um, uh, the Egyptians had slaves, Jews had slaves, the black nations had slaves, white people slaves too in parts of Asia. So we've all gone through it. Some may be more distant than others, but we've all suffered through it. And it always seems to be kind of a class sort of separation and not maybe color of skin, but more of who's elite and who's not. And so these sins and these things that happen to us and what we feel is not fair or just are just uh, they're no smaller or greater in God's eyes. And if it may not be as a big a suffering as somebody else, like who lost a child versus somebody whose bunny died, there's nothing that's insignificant to God. He wants us to share us always. And we may have a rabbit die 1 year or a pet or a child. And he's with us through all those plights, great or small. It's just always going to be a learning thing with him. And don't feel like you're burdening him with something that's not important because the rest of the world may have a bigger grief than you do. He wants to hear from you in all your happiness and concerns. They're all important to him.
And speaking of importance, I know that with growing up and especially being the only woman in your family, as far as, you had your two brothers, and grandma very much also had the same dynamic with her brother and so forth, with feeling you have to, as you were telling me earlier, you have to prove your worth when most of the guys in the workforce, men's is already assumed for potential.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were growing up, starting with your earlier jobs, with Rita McGahee, basically a Dick's Sporting Goods, stuff like that.
Surprised you remember that.
Oh yeah, I do. I remember all your stories. Maybe too many. But with those earlier jobs, it's about time. Hilarious pun for a watch shop. Air Canada, and then now flooring industry in modern times. What were probably the biggest takeaways you had from experience and being a woman in the workforce with how you're treated and how you were treating others?
Well, back when I was young, living in the workforce, women, we weren't paid as much as men. The only equalizing position that you could compensate would be sales. It's real estate or insurance or retail or cars or whatever. You had to be good at it. And if a woman was good at it, she had the equality of men. Now, it's very difficult for a company to say, well, we're not going to pay you the same amount of commission as a man. That wouldn't go over very well at all. Especially if you had a woman who says, wait a minute, she's better than this and these guys, especially residential real estate back in the mid 80s to on forward to today.
Mm-hmm.
Commercial real estate was starting to lean toward men, and then now it's taking its turn too. So you have real estate, car sales, soft sales, interior design. There's a lot of things that women can do that they're just better at than the men. Maybe not so much because they don't have the skill. It's just that it's more accepted that you do these things if you're a female, and it kind of came into that fold. I was always in sales, and so I felt like I was somewhat of an equal ground to men because I was very good at it, and I still am now, and I beat a lot of the guys in our company. And it's ability for are you male or female, and it's just a sexist thing. Um, there may be some hardcore cut, banking and financial and attorney things that may be still weighted heavily toward men, but women have a very, very good chance in sales, and that's why I decided to go in that direction. Plus, I was just very good at it, and I learned from my dad.
Mm-hmm. And I also just want to leave the floor to you. I've done this with pretty much every podcast, if not every single one.
Mm-hmm.
So is there something you want to ask of me?
Well, my question would be is, how do you feel today growing up in what a lot of people older than you are seems to be an immoral aspect, and with information at your fingertips, do you believe that you are learning the right thing the right way for the right reason?
Well, as far as immortality, I think because of media, it's a lot more skewed in the sense as because of the instantaneous nature of literally accessing anything from around the world, even within the limited circuits of communist countries, you can still reach out to someone there. No matter how limited their government is, you can still contact someone. So I don't think we're any less or more immoral than, let's say, when you grew up. It's more just you're inundated with so much more information at your fingertips that it comes across that way just simply because of the vastness. As far as, learning right and wrong, I mean, that's what any human being goes through, no matter what technological background they have. I mean, there's indigenous people on remote islands that still deal with immortality and infighting and tribes and all this stuff of learning what's right and wrong and a moral standard. And they don't have a set government like we do with legislation. They just kind of figure it out for themselves. So I think it's more of a question of, do you willingly want to actively grow and be a better person despite the environment you grow up in? Because that's really what it comes down to as far as morality. And it's no matter what age, you can learn and grow and improve on your life. And it's more just being open-minded enough to do that. And to swallow your pride and not have an ego when it comes to your own sin and realizing you can't always be right.
If you look back at your grandparents, older black and white movies from the 30s or the 40s, do you feel like society today is as polite and moral as it was then?
I mean, definitely not polite. I mean, back then they probably were just as bad, but it's more just, it was hush hush and more behind the scenes. Now that we have access to just say anything we want at a blink of an eye, it's just more out there and in the open because people just tend not to care as much because everyone does it.
We don't bear it as much as we used to because of the feeling of shame or what have you.
And I truly do know that we could have like a 12-hour podcast, honestly, with the wealth of wisdom that you have. Oh, I know. That's where I get it from. But I really do appreciate you being my second in-person interview that I've had for this particular podcast series. And I will launch next year on I Will Ask will not be a Christian, so we can get their perspective on how they grew up, what did they think as the church drove them away, and things like that, because their voice is just as important. So thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I'm really glad that my mom could be the anchor episode and the last one of the season before next week's recap.